In today's video, I am going to be explaining to you the concept of the exposure triangle. Shalom to you, my friends. My name is Isaac from Trego Studios, and in today's tutorial I want to explain to you the concept of exposure triangle. So what is the exposure triangle? Now, the exposure triangle is an imaginary triangle that explains the relationship between the exposure parameters of your camera. So there are three basic parameters that controls the exposure of your camera. We have the aperture, we have the ISO, and we have the shutter speed. Now these three things are what controls the exposure of your camera. Now when I say exposure of your camera, I'm referring to the light that is allowed into the sensor of your camera, which allows it to capture some particular details on your camera. It captures both the light areas and the shadows area. A proper camera exposure is going to capture enough details in both the light areas and the shadow areas. Now the exposure triangle helps us to understand the relationship between each of these parameters. In other words, each of these parameters are dependent on each other. Now let me try and explain each of these parameters and how they affect the exposure of your triangle. Now starting with the shutter speed, let me try and explain this in a very simple form. Now, do you know when a cameraman or a photographer snaps an image, that sound you hear when they snap an image is what you call the shutter sound. Most of our mobile phones also mimic that sound. You hear that shutter sound. Now that sound on a real camera is the sound of the shutter opening and closing. Now what is the shutter? The shutter is like a door that allows light into your camera. When the shutter is open, light is able to penetrate into the sensor of your camera, and then your camera is able to capture details of the scene. Now when it closes, light is not able to pass through. Now, the shutter speed is the amount of time it takes for your shutter to actually open and close. So, shutter speed is usually represented in fractions. You usually see it as 1 over something, 1 over 200, 1 over 250, 1 over 50. That's the shutter speed. It's possible that your camera displays it as a single figure, but in the real sense, the shutter speed is actually a fraction. So that fraction is actually a fraction of a second. Now, whatever fraction that you set your shutter speed is actually a fraction of a second. So in other words, when you set your shutter speed to 1 over 200, so it means that your shutter speed is going to open for 1 over 200 of a second. Alright? When you set it to 1 over 50, it means that your shutter speed is going to open for 1 over 50 of a second. Alright? How does the shutter speed affect your exposure? Now, when you try to increase your shutter speed, in other words, assuming it's in 1 over 50 before you increase it to 1 over 60 or 1 over 70. Now, the more you increase your shutter speed, the darker your image is, the less light your camera is able to capture. But when you reduce the shutter speed of your camera, it's going to allow more light into your camera. It's going to make your scene more exposed. Alright, now I'm going to be demonstrating that using this particular camera. Now my camera is connected to my mobile phone, so I can correct each of these parameters from my phone. I'm going to be recording this screen so that I can display it for you to see while I do all of those settings. Alright, now I'm recording the screen. Now if I want to correct the exposure of this particular camera, which I'm using to record this particular tutorial, by using the shutter speed parameter. Now for me to correct my shutter speed, the shutter speed is the one that is identified as the SS on this particular device. SS stands for shutter speed on my device. Now you notice that I'm shooting currently at a shutter speed of 1 over 50. So I told you that if you increase the shutter speed, your image gets darker. So you notice that as I increase the shutter speed, the image gets darker. Alright, now, and as I reduce the shutter speed, the image gets brighter. You understand? Now, but I have set mine to be at 1 over 50. I'm going to be explaining to you later as I go on in this tutorial why I set it at 50. 1 over 50, alright? Because you can't just set your shutter speed to anything that you like. Or you say, oh, because my image is dark, let me just reduce the shutter speed so that I can get a well exposed image. Or my image is too bright, let me just reduce my shutter speed. Now there are rules that you need to consider in the way you set your shutter speed, alright? But I'm going to explain that. And there's also an adverse effect that comes with the changes of each of these settings, even including the shutter speed. So if you increase or you decrease the shutter speed, there is an adverse effect that happens to it. Even though you might think that you are just correcting your exposure, it also has a particular effect it applies to it. Alright, now going straight to the second point. The second point is the aperture. Right, the aperture is like a windows on your lens. When you open the window, it allows more light into your camera. When you close it, it reduces the light that is permitted into the sensor of the camera. All right, so now how does the aperture affect the exposure of your camera? Just like your shutter speed, that when you increase the shutter speed, it gets darker. Similarly, also with aperture, when you increase the aperture, it gets darker. I'm going to demonstrate that on this mobile device again, which is connected to this camera. Now, when I try to increase the aperture is usually the one that is represented as f. There's always an f value in front of it when they represent it on your camera. It's usually a very low number compared to the shutter speed that can have 1/100, 1/200. All right, it's usually the least value. It contains the least value. Now you notice that as I change this aperture, as I increase it, the image gets darker. So as I reduce it, the image gets brighter. In other words, the lower your aperture, the more exposed your camera is, and the higher your aperture, the less exposed your camera is. All right, that's the second parameter on the exposure triangle. Okay, so two things you can use right now to correct or to adjust the exposure of a camera. Generally, when we are talking about setting the exposure of your camera, we are on either side of two things. The first thing is that either we are underexposed or we are overexposed. So when you're trying to set your exposure, your camera, when you're trying to set your camera for proper exposure, then that means that you either want to make your underexposed camera to become properly exposed, that is, let it come up high until it reaches a position that is properly exposed, or you make your overly exposed camera to come down to a point that it is evenly exposed, properly exposed. All right, now I've mentioned two parameters that you can use to affect this, these settings. All right, so imagine that you have an underexposed shot and you want to bring it up. What do? If you want to use your aperture, you have to reduce the value of your aperture. If it's not in the least value already, you have to reduce it so that you can get your image to become brighter. And if you want to use your shutter speed, you have to also reduce the value of the shutter speed to get the image to become brighter. Now, just as I said in the shutter speed aspect, the aperture also has an adverse effect. It has a secondary effect that it introduces into your shot when you try to increase or reduce the aperture. All right, I'm going to be explaining those effects once I mention the third parameter. Now, the third parameter of the exposure triangle that you use to adjust the exposure of a camera is the ISO. Now, the ISO simply is what exposes your camera to light. In other words, so when you increase the ISO, your camera is more sensitive to light, and when you reduce the ISO, your camera is less sensitive to light. In other words, the relationship of ISO is direct. If you increase the ISO, the image gets highly exposed. You reduce the ISO, the image gets less exposed. And I'm going to also demonstrate that again using this mobile phone connected to the device. All right, so this is my ISO, and you will notice that I'm presently at 400. My exposure is set to 400. All right, so when I increase it, you see that the image gets overly exposed. When I reduce it, the image starts to come down. When I reduce it to 200, that's the least value on this particular camera. So your camera might have 100, an ISO value of 100 is possible, so but the least on this camera is 200. So but I have set it to 400 because that is what works for this particular tutorial that I have set up for. Okay, so these are the three parameters that affect the exposure of your camera. Now, these three parameters are on each angles of the exposure triangle. You have the ISO, you have the shutter speed, and you have the aperture. Reducing one affects the other, increasing one affects the other part of the exposure, so they have a relationship together. All right, now what are the effects of changing any of these parameters? What are the adverse effects that comes with changing these parameters? All right, so I'm going to stop this video right now. I don't want it to get too long, so I'm going to continue this topic in a later episode. So remember to subscribe if you are new to this channel, if you have not done so, and click the notification bell so that you can be notified the next time I post the upcoming episode of this particular video. All right, on this channel we train media volunteers to become well equipped as a serve God through the media. So if that sounds like you as well and you want to receive videos like this, don't forget to subscribe. Thank you for staying to the end of this tutorial. So I come your way next time with a new tutorial. I want you to remain faithful in the Lord's service. God bless you. Bye.